Right, TikTok, time to rock. Thank you for joining us on Freed Indeed Live. Well, joining me on Freed Indeed Live, I am your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, the director of Freed Indeed Ministries. Unfortunately, Cheryl couldn't join us today because she struggles with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and today she has a particularly painful day. So if you all could just keep her in your prayers, that is an ongoing thing for her. So any prayers would be appreciated on that front. In the meantime, I'd like to begin by giving a thank you to our sponsor, Ophirin.com and Catalytic Conversations. So go ahead and follow the link in the description below, and you'll be supporting a friend of Freed Indeed Ministries. You will be receiving that great coaching benefit that we've been talking about, being able to help you learn how to set goals and follow through with them, more importantly. And finally, if you'd like to be awesome, like Ophirin.com and Catalytic Conversations are awesome, then you can follow the link in the description below to our Patreon page and support us on Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, you can make a huge difference while forking out practically nothing. On the other hand, if you can't even afford $3, we understand. You can still help us out for free by liking this video and hitting that subscribe button and then clicking the little bell icon next to it so that you'll be alerted every time we make a video. So thank you for joining us again. And today we are going to be discussing the wonderful world of violence in the media. And in particular, we're going to be discussing the Lord of the Rings. Because that is one of the best examples, I think, of Christian fantasy literature. So to go a little bit of backstory here, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, better known as J.R.R. Tolkien, was a Catholic, a very devout Catholic, who wrote, actually, before he ever published a work, he wrote down kind of a journal of all of his thoughts and ideas that were running through his head. And essentially, we know that work as the Silmarillion, the whole history of what's called Arda, which is the fictional land that Tolkien created. He was drawing heavily from various mythologies, most especially Norse mythology, which Tolkien actually studied on an academic level. He essentially wanted to write a Christian mythology. Now, don't be confused. He did not want to write an allegory about Christianity or World War I or any of the other things that it's usually said he was writing an allegory about. That's not true. He was not writing an allegory. He was writing essentially what we would call mythology. And J.R.R. Tolkien ended up becoming the father of what we know today as fantasy literature. So, literature that is not intended to be read as you would read a true story, but is intended to be read as a fantastic account of things that did not and cannot happen, but things that help to instruct us in what's called moral philosophy. So the reason why things like that are important is because when you read classical philosophic works like Plato, Aristotle, and all these guys, they are using myths. They're using particularly the Greco-Roman myths in most cases to bolster their arguments. And in the Christian religion, the one of the main Christian leaders is there's Saint Gregory, there's Saint Benedict. These are huge names in the Christian tradition. And one of the things that is often said there, especially with Saint Benedict, is this idea that the scriptures are often difficult to read, and a lot of the narrative portions of scripture do not lend themselves to moral instruction. So, for example, the story of Abraham is a wonderful story. We can see that Abraham was a righteous man, but at the same time, a lot of the things that Abraham does and says do not lend themselves to you should follow this example. And they certainly don't necessarily prima facie teach you things like what is manhood, what is womanhood. Again, you can learn a lot of those things, but you have to already study the moral philosophy itself diligently, and you have to have already studied the scriptures diligently before you'll come to right conclusions about how to apply these things. And I would argue that Saint Benedict has been proven correct, since we see people trying to use the Bible to argue for the idea of women's ordination, feminism, all these heresies that relate to moral philosophy. And Saint Benedict would say, well, right, because they aren't approaching the scriptures having learned diligently to understand why feminism is wrong, so they approach the scriptures through a feminist lens, and lo and behold, they see feminism even in passages that directly confute feminism. The point being, when we read other mythologies, Norse mythology, Greco-Roman mythology in particular, you can actually have sort of ready-made moral instruction right there in the story. It's pretty easy, in other words, to see how Achilles or Agamemnon or some of these other Greek heroes, especially Odysseus, how their wisdom and their understanding, how that instructs us in what is manhood, what is womanhood. And also, the other thing is that since these are people that we don't necessarily want, we are more easily able to discern where those people are wrong as well. So it's far easier to tell your kids, you should be wise and discerning like Odysseus, but you also shouldn't be a boaster like Odysseus was to the giant, because see how that messed up his whole life. Whereas it's more difficult to do that when it comes to, again, Abraham. You're talking about Abraham, and you don't really want to say, it was dumb for Abraham to pretend that his wife was his sister when he was in Egypt or when he was in Philistia. You don't really want to say that, because it sounds like you're insulting a man of great faith. It's far easier to pick out the good and throw out the bad when you know that the person you're talking about is either not real or is someone that doesn't really register as like a hero of faith. So for all of those reasons, it's really important to study the classics and these sorts of things. But I would argue that it's even better that we have fantasy literature like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis that is actually a mythology, if you will, or mythologies from the Christian worldview and perspective. So as you're reading these things, they're actually teaching you Christian messages, and you don't have to find Christian truths in them, because everything that they're saying is already Christian truth. And so you can, and actually, this becomes really important because, for example, there was a book that has recently come out, really awesome book. It's called Live Not by Lies. And the author of that book, who I believe is Eastern Orthodox, interviews several people who have suffered under different types of persecution in communism. And one of the families that he interacts with is a family in Prague. And you have to understand that this family is a huge success story of the Christian faith in a communist setting, in a persecuted setting, because all of their children and all of their grandchildren are still to this day faithful Catholic believers. So we need to learn, and whether you're Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, whatever, you need to learn, okay, in the United States, we are getting to this point that these people have lived through. And they can show you how to overcome the world in that setting. And one of the things that the mother in that family in particular said when she was discussing this was, she said, every night, no matter what, even though I had to work, even though I had to do whatever, I made sure that every single night I was reading to my children. And guess what she was reading? She was reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. She said that was the best book. And you know why? Because it holds the children's attention and it teaches Christian moral philosophy. When those kids grew up, they knew what it meant to be brave, they knew what it meant to stand courageous, and they knew what it meant, and they knew how to behave as men in the world and not be conformed to the world, because they had learned courage. So the point I'm driving at is not just, well, you've got to learn how to do these things, you've got to learn these skills, and the best way to do it is through fantasy. That's part of the point. But what you really need to understand is that God has created us in his image. Having created us in his image, God has imbued us with an imagination. In other words, like God, we are meant to be creators in our world. Little creators, and we are created for the purpose of what's called theosis, becoming one with God. So because we're created for this purpose, we are created so that we can be caught up into the divine nature. Because we've been created with that purpose, we've been given what's called an imagination. The imagination enables us to create. Now, the problem with the modern world is that it tries to destroy the imagination. Little boys who have big imaginations are labeled as having ADHD and given medication so that they won't have an imagination anymore. I was actually diagnosed with ADHD. Fortunately, my parents didn't give me medication, and I grew up to be a sane and normal individual, because lo and behold, having a big imagination is not something that will kill you. ADHD, but well, I'm not going to go on a whole soapbox about ADHD. We can talk about that in another lecture, another discussion time. But suffice it to say, ADHD is not a mental handicap. It's a sign that your brain is functioning at a rapid level. So we can talk about that another time. But anyway, the point being, reading fantasy literature is the opposite the opposite of medicating away your imagination. It is like food to your imagination. It fills out your imagination and builds worlds in which your imagination has the ability to flourish and develop and grow. So it's really super important for children to be exposed to these sorts of things, because in doing so, they become able to more fully utilize their imagination and more fully be caught up into that divine nature that they are supposed to be created in. So all of that is important, and I think all of these things are things that a lot of Christians understand inherently. But there's a couple of things that I hear really frequently said against something like Lord of the Rings. And so we're going to address a couple of points. One is, well, Lord of the Rings has wizards. Wizards do magic. Magic is bad. Therefore, Lord of the Rings teaches witchcraft. That's actually... so there's a couple of reasons why that's a misunderstanding. First, the beings in the Lord of the Rings universe that are called wizards are actually a set of lesser divine beings created by the god Eru, which Tolkien himself says Eru is the Christian god adapted to Arda. So you could read Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all of Tolkien's Legendarium, and you would be seeing how Tolkien imagines the Christian god interacting with this world called Arda. And then Tolkien would say, then you can pick up the Bible and read about the Christian god interacting with this world called Earth. So Tolkien actually makes God a character, if you will, in his stories, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that these lesser divine beings actually, after one of the wars in Arda, they took on human form, and they took on the form of old men so that they could teach wisdom and so that they could help the sons of men and the sons of elves to overcome the evils in their world. In other words, wizards aren't people. They're more like angels or even angelic beings, maybe more like the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, the sons of God who came and dwelt among the sons of men. They're more like that kind of concept. So as a result, they're not really wizards doing magic in the way that like Harry Potter is doing witchcraft that would have had him burned at the stake a couple hundred years ago. It's actually more like when angels come and can make things happen. So that's one thing. But even apart from that, I think it ignores the genre itself. The genre is fantasy. It's going to have fantastical things happening. This is part of cultivating your imagination, is to learn how to imagine things that aren't real. So if you don't have the ability to discern between reality and fiction, then yeah, don't read Lord of the Rings, but check yourself into Bellevue, because that's really weird that you don't have the ability to discern between reality and fantasy. And by the way, in that, I made a reference to Harry Potter. You do have to have discernment like you do for everything. And so something like Harry Potter is in a different category than something like Lord of the Rings. I think Christians have a responsibility to themselves and to their children to read certain types of fantasy like Lord of the Rings to cultivate their imagination and to grow as people. However, again, like with all things, we practice discernment. The problem with Harry Potter is that A, that's real witchcraft in the sense that Scripture condemns. But B, and more fundamentally, Harry Potter was written by an anti-Christian feminist, not someone that I want teaching my children about life. So I will say this. I think that as a Christian, you're free to read Harry Potter if you want to, but you should only do that when you've learned discernment enough to be able to enjoy the story, but also be refuting its claims. In the Orthopraxis podcast, they actually gave a good example of this kind of thing by talking about, I could read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler and not really be affected by it because, I am a functioning adult who's capable of reading something I disagree with and comprehending something I disagree with and still disagreeing with it. So I'm actually able to read a book and say, yeah, I don't believe that this is correct, even as I'm reading it. The problem that arises would be if I read a book that was a fantasy or fiction novel that is an outgrowth of the same philosophy. So it's a fantasy novel that's teaching the philosophy found within Mein Kampf. That becomes a problem because it's not as direct. It's not teaching what it's teaching outright. It's saying it in such a way that it intentionally tries to make me sympathetic to the points found therein. In other words, the narrative of the story tries to make me sympathetic with what the narrator wants me to believe. So that becomes a problem when that belief is something inherently anti-Christian. So that's my concern about something like Harry Potter, is that the beliefs of J.K. Rowling are things that are not Christian and that will inevitably bleed into her works. That said, like I said before, I do think you have the freedom and liberty to read J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter in particular if you really want to. I don't particularly want to be perfectly honest. I read them as a little kid. I never read the last book because I lost interest, but it's not something I actually take an interest in. If you do, though, then what I would suggest is that you read it and then maybe read something that explains why some of these things are wrong. Read some book that really solidly affirms the Christian faith in a way that has powerful explanatory force. That's probably the best thing I can recommend. Just as I would encourage, if someone is reading the classics, I would encourage them to read, for example, the Iliad and the Odyssey and be reading, the works of Plato so that you're getting the message that you ought to be getting, but you're not just getting a bunch of bunk. Or better yet, you could read St. Augustine's The City of God, and he's constantly referencing the classics. He's constantly utilizing the classics, but you're getting it from a Christian source. So you're understanding it. So read the classics, read the Iliad, read the Odyssey, read these things, and then read St. Augustine so that you know what you're supposed to get from it and where it's completely wrong. Just in case you missed something. That said, I'm assuming the people watching this are capable of using their reasoning brains. And so I'm not afraid that you're going to pick up Harry Potter or the Odyssey and think, oh, I need to start worshiping Athena now. No, I'm not afraid of that. I think you can read these things and learn from them by virtue of the fact that God gave you a brain, and I'm confident you're capable of using it. So that's kind of my suggestion for that. Now, another thing that often comes up is, And I've heard this argument particularly from moms who don't want their little boys to act like boys. And that is, Lord of the Rings is really violent. Should my child really be exposed to violence? The answer is yes. And actually, whether your child is male or female, they should be exposed to violence in literature. Do you know why? The reason why is because the world is a violent place. I realize that we live in a first world country and for the most part have the luxury of not having to see a whole lot of violence. In fact, we get it shielded from us because if somebody is drunk and behaving belligerent, you get to call the bully squad and have them come and arrest the person. You don't have to punch their lights out yourself. And the reason why I say that negatively is not because I have anything against the police inherently. What I have a problem with is things where people call the police and have the police, responding to a quote-unquote threat or to brandishing a weapon. And what really happened is that, I've literally seen times where someone pulls out a knife to get someone to leave them alone, someone who's getting in their face, and then they're in handcuffs for supposedly brandishing a weapon when they were actually trying to defuse the situation. But guess what? The police weren't there. They got called by somebody who wanted a bully squad. So, frankly, I think that American society punishes you for being male, but that is that's a whole other broadcast for us to do. The point being, unlike modern American society, J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings teaches you how to be masculine and how to exalt femininity. So this is an important point. For example, the book The Hobbit, it has been noted that the book The Hobbit, one of the critiques that modern readers have of the book is that it doesn't have any quote-unquote strong female characters. That was actually intentional. And that's one of the reasons why I hate the Hobbit movies, because Peter Jackson decided that he was going to correct Tolkien's intention by adding a completely unnecessary female character who was just pathetically useless to the plot of the movie, since she wasn't supposed to be there. But J.R.R. Tolkien writes the book with the intention of teaching young boys how to be men. As a result, he doesn't need to add any quote-unquote strong female characters, since that would only distract from the purpose of showing young boys how to be men. It is important for young men to learn the virtues of masculinity, and in order to do that, they need to be exposed to violence, because violence is where masculinity is most thoroughly on display. Men were created for certain deeds. Men were created to be protectors, to be the stronger. That's why the Hebrew word and the word used in Scripture for woman means soft one, because the woman is the soft one, the man is the hard one, the ish, which I think is a funny word. But anyway, so men are intended to display their masculinity. Not always. You don't want to be an angry man who's constantly violent, but your masculinity ought to be capable of violence. One of the great quotes from history is, a good man is not a docile man. A good man is a violent man under control. And the reason why that's so significant is because in order to learn masculine virtue, the most sort of poignant way that can be taught to you, whether you like this or not, you don't have to like what I'm saying, but it's a fact. The most poignant way you can learn that is through the battlefield analogy. Aragorn cutting off the head of an orc is important, whether you find that pleasant to read about or not. It's important that you understand. It's important that you know you may be called upon to be courageous someday. You may be called upon to die for the gospel someday. You may be called upon to kill someone to protect your wife and children someday. That's part of being a man. It's also important, I said before, for young girls to read books that include violence. That's because young girls, for the most part, unless they're going to become a nun, and even then, I'll get to that in a second. Unless they're going to become a nun, they're going to get married. And you do not want your daughter to marry a sissy boy who can't squish a spider without screaming. You want your daughter to marry a warrior. And if you say, oh my goodness, that's scary. No, what's scary? Here's what's scary. Your daughter is walking with her sissy boy husband down the street, and someone pulls a gun on them, and her husband squeals like a child and runs away. That's scary. But I'll tell you what's not scary. If my wife and I are walking down that same street, I save your daughter's life without a second thought by stabbing the guy who pulled a gun on her and risking my own life because I'm a man. And your daughter didn't marry a man. She married whatever you taught her to marry because you were too afraid to let her see that the world is a violent place. And before you tell me that that's an extreme analogy, I'm going to be honest. The world is a pretty terrifying place when you're a coward. That's why violent literature is important. It teaches us not to be cowards. Women also need to learn femininity. They need to read books that teach them femininity. So The Hunger Games is out because it teaches women that the only kind of good woman is a masculine woman. Any book or movie that's trying to teach women to take a masculine role is probably not what you want your daughters to be exposed to. Again, I have to be a little bit nuanced here because I think that a really solid Christian family can take their daughter to go see Wonder Woman or Mad Max, but that's if you've built the kind of relationship where you're able to correct the movie, where you're able to talk about the pros and cons of the movie and explain what the movie is teaching that's false, and that sort of thing. Then, by all means, take your kids to go see it. If you don't have that kind of relationship with your kids, and I've made this mistake myself, but I'm going to say to anybody watching, don't make that mistake because you're only breeding confusion. Because you don't have the kind, just because so-and-so elder at your church or so-and-so the Orthodox priest, whatever, just because he has the kind of relationship with his daughter where he can take her to go see Captain Marvel and she doesn't learn anything feminist from it because he's able to instruct, that doesn't mean you have that. And so what I'd recommend is have your daughters being exposed to feminine virtue and masculine virtue. And when in doubt, don't watch or don't read. Well, it's that simple. But don't, what I'm driving at here is don't say, well, I'm not going to watch this or I'm not going to read this because it has violence in it. Because violence is part of the world. It's important. So we shouldn't, I find it abysmal and frankly abominable that there are Christians out there who will not pick up a book because they're afraid of the fact that it includes violence. Guess what? The world includes violence. You can't shelter yourself or your children from it, and you need to be ready for it. This is something that our forefathers understood much better than we do because they lived in a violent world. And if you don't want to take my word for it, take the words of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who said, "The kingdom of heaven is violent, and the violent take it by force." So, the kingdom of heaven itself is a violent place, and the violent take it by force. And if you're shocked by that and say, isn't heaven a super peaceful place? All of the archangels have swords. And Saint Michael used his sword to cast Satan out of heaven. In fact, in Paradise Lost, Saint Michael has a sword of fire with which he casts Michael out of heaven. If you're afraid of violence, you won't fit in among the angelic host because they aren't. So don't be afraid of violence. Train your mind to be able to examine things here in a meaningful way here on earth and say, I need to understand this. Another thing that I often recommend for people to do is to learn martial arts. Give yourself an outlet to learn how to interact with violent situations. Learn Kung Fu, learn karate, learn Taekwondo, whatever. Learn these things because the benefits of them are great. And actually, if you really want to learn great martial arts, learn HEMA, Historic European Martial Arts. Super cool. You'll be learning how to use the weapons that the Crusaders used to defeat Saladin and his host of evil. You will be learning how to use weapons that our ancestors used, that my ancestors used at the Battle of Kaer Morhen to push out those Norse pagans who were stealing our women to be their rape slaves. My ancestors pushed them out of Ireland and drove them out. The weapons my ancestors used to beat back the Turk when the Turk was invading, and my Polish ancestors mounted up on their horses and stood their ground nobly and pushed back the Turkish hordes. These are stories that so many Christians, especially evangelicals, are scared to tell their children because, oh, that's Christians doing violent things. It's scary. No, it's not. It's glorious. The Battle of Agincourt. My wife and I watched a movie last night called The King, and one of the pinnacle moments is the Battle of Agincourt, where King Henry V defeated the flower of French chivalry in a single day. This is something glorious. We should tell our children about this. This is noble. Charles Martel stopping the Islamic advance into Europe and earning for himself the name Charles the Hammer, because with his sword and with his shield, he pushed back against the Muslim forces and saved Europe from 1,000 years of darkness. Or the noble Queen Isabella, the warrior queen who pushed the Turk out of her land and who said, "Tear down that ugly crescent moon and erect the noble cross. For this day Grenada is Christian and all men shall know it." That is not something, Christian, for you to be ashamed of. That is something for you to revel in. That is something for you to rejoice in. Our ancestors fought nobly for good causes and did well. And you should not be ashamed of that. Just because the media tells you you should, and just because a secular society that hates masculinity but wants women to be masculine tells you you should. That's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to glory in. So yes, study those historical events and study the mythology, the Christian mythology of J.R.R. Tolkien and of C.S. Lewis, and study these great things, because in doing so, you'll be cultivating in yourself that which enabled the great men and women of old to be great. So I think that pretty well covers it. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Like, subscribe, jingle the bell icon because it's almost Christmas, and you may as well start jingling your bells now. And of course, we always ask that you support us on Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, which is practically nothing, you can make a big difference for Freed Indeed Ministries, enabling us to carry out our global mission. Please do share this with your friends and family so that they too can learn masculine and feminine virtue and learn the means of acquiring it, and thus they can be freed indeed by the blood of the Lamb.